Darby's translation 1890. John 18. Jesus, having said these things, went out with his disciples beyond the torrent Cedron, where was a garden, into which he entered, he and his disciples. And Judas also, who delivered him up, knew the place, because Jesus was often there, in company with his disciples. Judas therefore, having got the band, and officers of the chief priests and Pharisees, comes there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Jesus therefore, knowing all things that were coming upon him, went forth and said to them, Whom seek ye? They answered him, Jesus the Nazarene. Jesus says to them, I am he. And Judas also, who delivered him up, stood with them. When therefore he said to them, I am he, they went away backward and fell to the ground. He demanded of them therefore again, Whom seek ye? And they said, Jesus the Nazarene. Jesus answered, I told you that I am he. If therefore ye seek me, let these go away, that the word might be fulfilled which he spoke, As to those whom thou hast given me, I have not lost one of them. Simon Peter therefore, having a sword, drew it, and smote the bondman of the high priest and cut off his right ear, and the bondman's name was Malchus. Jesus therefore said to Peter, Put the sword into the sheath. The cup which the Father has given me, shall I not drink it? The band therefore, and the chiliarch, and the officers of the Jews, took Jesus, and bound him. And they led him away to Annas first, for he was father-in-law to Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. But it was Caiaphas who counseled the Jews that it was better that one man should perish for the people. Now Simon Peter followed Jesus, and the other disciple. But that disciple was known to the high priest, and went in with Jesus into the palace of the high priest, but Peter stood at the door without. The other disciple therefore, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the porteress and brought in Peter. The maid therefore, who was porteress, says to Peter, Art thou also of the disciples of this man? He says, I am not. But the bondmen and officers, having made a fire of coals, for it was cold, stood and warmed themselves, and Peter was standing with them and warming himself. The high priest therefore demanded of Jesus concerning his disciples and concerning his doctrine. Jesus answered him, I spoke openly to the world. I taught always in the synagogue and in the temple, where all the Jews come together, and in secret I have spoken nothing. Why demandest thou of me? Demand of those who have heard what I have spoken to them. Behold, they know what I have said. But as he said these things, one of the officers who stood by gave a blow on the face to Jesus, saying, Answerest thou the high priest thus? Jesus answered him, If I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil, but if well, why smitest thou me? Annas then had sent him bound to Caiaphas the high priest. But Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. They said therefore to him, Art thou also of his disciples? He denied, and said, I am not. One of the bondmen of the high priest, who was kinsman of him whose ear Peter cut off, says, Did not I see thee in the garden with him? Peter denied therefore again, and immediately the cock crew. They lead therefore Jesus from Caiaphas to the praetorium, and it was early morn. And they entered not into the praetorium, that they might not be defiled, but eat the Passover. Pilate therefore went out to them and said, What accusation do ye bring against this man? They answered and said to him, If this man were not an evildoer, we should not have delivered him up to thee. Pilate therefore said to them, Take him, ye, and judge him according to your law. The Jews therefore said to him, It is not permitted to us to put anyone to death, that the word of Jesus might be fulfilled which he spoke, signifying what death he should die. Pilate therefore entered again into the praetorium and called Jesus, and said to him, Thou art the king of the Jews? Jesus answered him, Dost thou say this of thyself, or have others said it to thee concerning me? Pilate answered, Am I a Jew? Thy nation and the chief priests have delivered thee up to me. What hast thou done? Jesus answered, My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants had fought that I might not be delivered up to the Jews, but now my kingdom is not from hence. Pilate therefore said to him, Thou art then a king? Jesus answered, Thou sayest it, that I am a king. I have been born for this, and for this I have come into the world, that I might bear witness to the truth. Everyone that is of the truth hears my voice. Pilate says to him, What is truth? And having said this he went out again to the Jews, and says to them, I find no fault whatever in him. But ye have a custom that I release someone to you at the Passover. Will ye therefore that I release unto you the King of the Jews? They cried therefore again all, saying, Not this man, but Barabbas, Barabbas. Now Barabbas was a robber. John 18. By F. B. Hole. Having communed with the Father and expressed his desires, Jesus went forth to meet his foes, who were led by the traitor, and then to the death that he should die. True to the character of this gospel, striking witness is borne to his omniscience. He went forth in the full knowledge of all things that should come upon him, not only of outward circumstances but of the inward weight of all involved. If we refer back to John 6 verse 6, and John 13 verse 3, we shall find statements of similar import. But the scene in the garden also furnishes us with a display of his omnipotence. They sought Jesus of Nazareth, but when he replied, I am, reminiscent of the way Jehovah declared himself in the Old Testament, they were felled to the ground. Thus irresistibly, yet unwillingly, they did obeisance before him. So the signs of his deity were present even while he submitted to their hands, since he was here as the man subject to the Father's will. His desire was to extend protection to his disciples according to his own word, and Peter's zealous but mistaken action only gave occasion to the display of his complete oneness of mind with the Father. He accepted all as coming from his hands, even though the highest religious authorities in Jewry were his chief opponents. The servant of the high priest, Malchus, was prominent in his arrest, and to the tribunal of Annas and Caiaphas was he first led. Caiaphas had the decisive voice and was already determined upon his death. Verses 15 to 18 are parenthetical, as again are verses 25 to 27. Taken together they give us the sad story of Peter's downfall, in which the Lord's prediction of John 13 verse 38 was fulfilled. That this should be one of the few episodes recorded by all four evangelists is worthy of note. God does not take pleasure in recording the sins of his saints, so we may be sure that there is in it warning and instruction much needed by all saints in all ages, for self-confidence is one of the commonest and most deep-seated tendencies of the flesh, a tendency which, if not judged and refused, invariably leads to disaster. True spiritual circumcision involves no confidence in the flesh, see Philippians 3 verse 3, but that is a lesson we do not learn save through a good deal of painful experience. The other disciple known to the high priest was pretty evidently John himself. His acquaintance with the high priest gave him a little worldly status and privilege, which he used to introduce Peter into the place of danger. The word also in verse 17 seems to imply that the damsel keeping the door knew that John was a disciple of Jesus. He had not been tempted to deny the fact as Peter had. That which trips up one disciple may leave another unmoved. Moreover, Satan knows just exactly how to set his traps. That the third questioner should be a relation of the Malchus, who had suffered in the garden at Peter's hands, was a masterstroke of his craft. That encompassed Peter's third and worst denial, and his sin and discomfiture were complete. Verses 19 to 24 give details of what transpired in the palace of the high priest, and they are the connecting link between verses 14 and 28. The question raised as to his disciples and doctrine was an attempt to obtain from his lips something incriminating as a basis for the death sentence they had determined to pronounce. The other Gospels tell us that they sought for witness against him and found none, which accounts for the fact that when he referred them to the witness of his hearers they were so irritated as to strike our Lord. Matthew tells us that they went so far as to seek false witness against him. It is well to note the contrast between Jesus in verse 23 and Paul in Acts 23 verse 5. There is a gulf between the master and the most devoted of his servants. The reply of Jesus was conclusive. There was no evil to which any could bear witness, no one could convince him of sin. John's account of the proceedings before the high priest is very brief. In contrast to this, he gives us a fuller account of what transpired before Pilate than any of the others. Paul writes of Christ Jesus, who before Pontius Pilate witnessed a good confession, and the details of that good confession come particularly to light here. First, however, we are given a sight of the fearful hypocrisy of the Jewish leaders. To have walked inside the judgment hall would have defiled them, so they felt. Yet they had no scruple as to committing themselves to murder, and hunting for liars in order to give some semblance of decency to their action. Alas! Alas! To such lengths will religious flesh proceed. Pilate rightly desired a definite accusation, but, having none to offer, they attempted in the first place to rush Pilate into a verdict on the general plea that he was an evildoer. To denounce on general grounds, whilst avoiding any specific charge, is a common trick of the religious persecutor. This irregularity made Pilate wish to throw the case back on their hands. Their answers showed that they were determined upon his death, yet it led to the fulfillment of the Lord's own predictions as to the death he should die. See John 3 verse 14, John 8 verse 28, John 12 verse 32. However, they eventually fixed on the charge that he sought to make himself a king. The Lord's question in verse 34 infers this, and it comes clearly to light in the next chapter, verse 12. The good confession before Pilate covered at least 4 great points. First, the Lord boldly confessed that he was a king. The context shows that in saying this he referred not merely to the fact that he was the true son of David according to the flesh, but that he held the place as Son of God, just as Psalm 2 predicted. But secondly, he affirmed that his kingdom was neither of this world, nor from hence. It does not bear the character or stamp of this world, nor does it derive its authority and power from this place. His kingdom of course derives all its authority and power from heaven, and it bears the heavenly character, but instead of stating this positively he put the matter in that negative light which tacitly put a sentence of condemnation and repudiation upon this world and this place. It was a bold statement to make in the presence of the man who represented the greatest existing earthly power. Thirdly, he asserted that he was born to kingship inasmuch as he came into the world as the witness to the truth. He who brings the light of truth is the only one fitted to hold the royal power, as David stated in 2 Samuel 23 verse 3. We started this gospel with the fact that grace and truth came by Jesus Christ, but in this moment of crisis grace had been rejected and truth was the matter in question. Outside were the men who embodied lying and hypocrisy. Pilate held the judicial authority, and therefore was responsible to discern truth and judge accordingly, but his question, "What is truth?" was evidently uttered in a vein of flippant skepticism, and showed how judgment was divorced from righteousness in his mind. As a Roman judge he knew all too much of men and their deceits, and he felt that to pursue truth was to chase a mirage. But this did not excuse his folly, manifested in turning his back on Christ and going out to the lying Jews directly he had asked his question. Fourthly, he claimed to be not merely the witness to the truth, but the very embodiment of truth itself. In the farewell discourse he had said, "I am the truth," to his disciples. Now before his adversaries the same thing is implicit in the remarkable words, "Everyone that is of the truth hears my voice." He is the truth in such absolute fashion that he is the test of every man. Those of whom it can be said, "Of his own will begot he us with the word of truth," James 1 verse 18, are of the truth, and such hear his voice. It is remarkable how often in this gospel our attention is called to hearing his voice or hearing his word. See, for instance, John 3 verse 34, John 4 verse 42, John 5 verses 24 to 25, 28, John 6 verse 68, John 7 verse 17, John 8 verse 43, John 10 verses 4 and 16, 27, John 12 verses 48 to 50. Everything hinges upon it for us, as these scriptures make manifest, and, to use a modern illustration, we must be on the right wavelength in order to hear. Nothing but being begotten of God with the word of truth can put us on the right wavelength. Pilate had no real ear for his voice, as his words and action plainly showed. He walked out from the presence of the truth that again he might establish contact with the world of unreality, yet he had sufficient judicial sense to perceive how false was the case against the Lord and to pronounce him to be without fault. His effort, however, to sidetrack the accusers by the Passover custom failed, yet it was overruled to bring out in the plainest possible fashion their implacable hostility. 5 words sufficed to express their utter rejection of the Lord, not this man, but Barabbas, and they were wholly unanimous, for this was the cry of all. The evangelist's comment on this cry is equally terse and also compressed into 5 words, "Now Barabbas was a robber." Without exaggeration we may designate this cry as the most faithful in all history. It has controlled the course of the world for nearly 2,000 years and will ultimately seal its doom. More particularly we might say it has controlled the sad course of Jewish history. What have they not endured at the hands of the spoilers during the centuries? But if they cry out and even wish to complain against God, it is sufficient answer to refer them to this unanimous demand of their leaders. The one who was the embodiment of grace and truth they rejected. Barabbas, the robber, they demanded. Incidentally, he was also a revolutionary and a murderer, as other Gospels show. Robbery, revolution, and murder has been their portion with a vengeance, right through the centuries. The fact is that in the holy government of God they have just reaped what they have sown. And the same thing has been true of the Gentile world generally, though perhaps on not quite so intensive a scale. Still, again and again through the years there have arisen men of striking personality in whom the Barabbas spirit has reappeared. At the present moment the earth is groaning beneath this very thing. As we contemplate the sufferings of many peoples, we have to remind ourselves, now Barabbas was a robber.